Good evening, everyone. This week's Parsha is Parshas Teitzei, Tavshin Pei Hey, and we shall start from the beginning, which is Perek Chaf Aleph, chapter 21, Pasuk Yud, verse 10. Teitzei lemelchama alo yavecha. When you go out to war against your enemies, Hashem will give the enemy into your hand, the shavisa shivya, and you will take captives. Isa bashivya, and you shall see amongst the captives Esha Yafas Tayar, a beautiful woman. V'chashakta ba, you shall desire her. Lakachta l'cha v'ish, and take her for a wife. Now, so the situation here is, as we just read, there's been a war, they've taken captives, and amongst the captives a beautiful woman. The soldier sees her and desires her, and the Torah says he could take her for a wife. Now, at the same time, without reading through the rest of what's going on, the Torah talks about a process by which you bring her home, and you kind of take away her beauty for a time, and she actually is meant to be there in front of you in a unbecoming way. And if you still want to keep her for a wife, you can. If not, you have to let her go free. It's not like now she's your slave or anything like that. She's her servant. You have to let her go free. So it's a very interesting topic, the whole thing here, that, the Torah is saying, you see this captive woman and you can take her for a wife. I mean, she's not Jewish, right? We're not talking about Jews here. She's not Jewish. And the Torah is still saying you can take her for a wife. So Rashi cites the Talmud that says, that gives us, interestingly, a reason for why the Torah permits this. And Rashi says, Lo dibra Torah l'keneged yetzer hara. The Torah was acting or speaking against a man's evil inclination. Shemen HaKadosh Baruch Hu matira. If God does not permit her, yise'ena be'isser. He's going to marry her in a forbidden manner. Meaning, in this situation, the Torah says, or the Torah evaluates the situation, that this soldier, if he sees this beautiful woman, there's nothing going to stop him. There's no way he's going to stop. It's like he's out of control, and he's going to take her anyway. So the Torah therefore says better that he take her permissibly than in a forbidden manner. And the way this is understood is that the Torah sees a scenario where a soldier is very stressed by the war. War is a very difficult and stressful situation. And in that whole state of tumult, in that whole state of in that very, I don't want to use too harsh a word, but in a certain degree, in that crazed state that can happen to a person in war, and he sees this beautiful woman, he's not going to be able to control himself. It's not a normal situation. It's not a situation where just, go ahead, you see someone, I can't control myself. This is a soldier. He's just come out of war, under the pressures of war, under the craziness of war. And the Torah says for that situation, because of that kind of situation, the Torah says, there's no way he's going to be able to control himself, and therefore we will let him do it permissibly instead of in a forbidden manner.
It means this is like an exception because of the war.
Yes.
If there is no war?
No, correct. It's exception because it's coming from war. Now, the Torah still says that when Rashi brings out again from the Gemara, from the Talmud, that at the end of the day, this marriage isn't going to succeed. Not going to succeed. Because right afterwards, the Torah talks about a situation where a man has two wives, which, according to Torah law, a man is allowed to have two wives. One of them he loves, and one of them he doesn't like anymore. And he has a problem. The firstborn, right, gets the double portion of his inheritance. The problem is that the wife that he doesn't like anymore is the wife who gave birth to his firstborn son. And the Torah says you cannot do anything to take away that firstborn right from him and give it to the firstborn of the wife that you love. That's the next thing the Torah talks about. The next thing the Torah talks about, the third thing in the list of things in the beginning of the parsha, is called Ben Serer Umayra. Ben Serer Umayra it translates as the wayward and rebellious son. The rebellious son he's gluttonous, he eats a lot of meat at a time and drinks a lot of wine, and he's just basically out of control of he's out of his self-control. And the Torah talks about that under certain circumstances where he's so out of control, even though he's a young boy, we actually put him to death, but because his trajectory in life is not good based on the way he's behaving. And therefore, the Torah says, again, under very unusual circumstances, he can be put to death. I'm not going to go into that right now. But the Talmud says is that these three things following one another the Torah is telling a person, we're permitting you to marry this woman, this captive woman. But if you do, it's not a good future. The marriage is not going to stay good. And thirdly, the child that comes out of it is going to be a rebellious child. That's what Rashi brings down from the Talmud. Now, so I want to share with you now a thought from the Chassam Sefer that gives a very, very interesting insight to what we just spoke about, and it also has a very interesting lesson to take from it. So we're going to go now to a story in Tanakh, in Shmuel Beis, in Samuel 2, or 2 Samuel, however they say it in English, and we're going to go to the story of David HaMelech, King David, and his son who rebelled against him. You know, David HaMelech had a son who rebelled against him, more than one son who did it. And you know the name of the son who rebelled against him? Avshalom. Correct. Avshalom. And in Shmuel Beis, Perek Tesvav, chapter 15, it talks about how David HaMelech realizes that he and his followers have to flee. They have to run away because Avshalom is going to kill him. That's how far it went. Avshalom is going to kill his father to become king, and David HaMelech had to run away. So in Perek Tesvav, Pasuk Lamed Beis, chapter 15, verse 32, Vahi David ba'ad harosh, David came to the top, Asher yishtachav Hashem le'elokim, where people would bow down to God, some kind of area where people it seemed would pray. V'hinei likrasai hu shai ha'arki, and greeting him was a man named Hushai ha'arki. He called the Archite. He was from a place called Arki. Karua kutantai, his robe was torn. V'adama aroshai, and earth on his head. Now Hushai was an ally, a friend of David. So the fact that it says that his robe was torn, there was earth on his head, that's a sign of mourning, which is a sign of mourning over the situation. So if you just read these words, it sounds like David came to the top of some high area, and Hushai greeted him in a state of, robe torn and earth on his head. The Talmud in Sanhedrin, Kuf Zayin and Aleph, 107a, tells us there was a lot more going on here at this point. So the first thing that it says here is just mind-boggling. You ready? The Talmud says that when David came up to the top to this area, David was considering becoming an idol worshiper. And the word Rosh, it shows there's a different place where the word Rosh it means idol worship. So where it says David came until the Rosh, where people would bow down, it was at this point that he was considering becoming an idol worshiper. The Talmud says this is a tradition that it has, and it's saying it was happening at this point. The Torah does the book of Shmuel doesn't say it outright, but this is part of the tradition, oral tradition that we have, and this is what he wanted to do. Shocking, right? Hushai ha'arki basically was the one who stopped him. He stopped him. So what went on between them? So what went on did like this. Hushai sees David HaMelech, and he says to him, Amar loy David, he said to David, Yoimru, if you worship idols, people will say, Melech shekamois chayaved avodah zara, a king like you, a great, pious person like you, became an idol worshiper? Do you know what that means to people? That someone as righteous as you should become an idol worshiper? What kind of desecration of God's name that is? What kind of an influence that can have on people? Like, what are you doing? Omar Loi, so David HaMelech said back to him, Melech shekamaisi yargenu b'nai? A king like me, his son should kill him? Rashi explains, David HaMelech said like this, I know who I am. I know how people look at me. And they're going to say, King David's own son killed him? Why would God allow such a thing to happen? That's what Rashi says David was saying. Why would God allow such? People are going to say, how could God allow such a thing? And therefore, that's going to be, people are going to start questioning God. That's a desecration of the God's name. So you know what? Mutav Yaved Avodah Zara. Better I become an idol worshiper. Meaning, he's not going to believe in the idol worship, but he's going to do it, which you're not allowed to do even if you're faking. But he's going to go ahead, he's going to worship the idol. He'll look like an idol worshiper, so that when his son kills him, people will say, oh, you know why he got killed? Because he became an idol worshiper. So David HaMelech was doing this all for a good reason. He wasn't just like, saying, God, you're abandoning me and I'm turning to idols. That's not what he was doing here. What he was doing here was he was saying there's a greater desecration of God's name if I get killed just as is. And that's why I want to worship idols. Again, I'm not going to really believe in them, but I'll worship idols. And when my son kills me, which he was pretty convinced, as you can see, his son is going to kill him, or there's at least a very, very, very good chance of it. And he said, and that'll prevent the other desecration of God's name. But at the end of the day, who won the argument? Hushai. At the end of the day, David HaMelech didn't do it. He didn't worship idols. Because Hushai's argument was, at the end of the day, that you should become an idol worshiper will be worse. Will be worse in people's eyes. That'll be a greater desecration of God's name than what you say. And David HaMelech accepted. Okay, so that's the Gemara.
Who was right?
Hushai. Because David HaMelech himself agreed. He didn't do it at the end.
But what is major question that David asked? How Hashem permit son to kill father?
That is so, but at the same time, but against that is the idea that the righteous David HaMelech became an idol worshiper. That's going to be a problem in people's minds too. So you've got two issues here to deal with. Okay, now. So that's the Gemara. So the Chassam Sofer, he cites this Gemara, and I'm sorry, I didn't finish the Gemara. Gemara's not over. The Gemara says, Hushai then said to him, basically, you know why all this is happening to you? Do you know why your son is rebelling against you and wants to kill you? You know why? These things don't just happen on their own, especially to someone like David HaMelech. Do you know why it's happening to you? Because Avshalom's mother was Ishia Fastayar. She was a captive woman. She was a woman who David married. He went to war. He saw her. He took her for a wife. He says, this is why it's happening to you. So David says back to him, I didn't do anything wrong. The Torah says I'm allowed to do it. And on that, Hushai said to him, what I told you from Rashi, don't you know the whole idea about the fact that all these three subjects are next to each other to teach that if a person marries such a woman, a captive woman, his son is going to be rebellious? Don't you know that? Don't you know that Gemara? Don't you know that idea, that concept? That's the end of the Gemara. So Hushai is applying this idea. So the Chassam Sofer has a very interesting question. and even what I think, and a very interesting answer. So he says the whole idea that the Torah permits you to marry this captive woman, but the Torah says, but you're only going to have trouble from it. That bothers him. He says that's difficult to understand. It's difficult to understand something that is permissible, and you're going to tell me that even though it's permissible, is only bad going to come from it. That's bothered to say only bad is going to come from this kind of permissible thing. That troubles him.
But there is no Torah.
The Talmud said that.
Talmud said, but the Torah didn't say.
Right, but the Talmud says, and he's asking, but he says,
If it is permissible,
if it's to say this idea that it's permissible, but only bad is going to come from it. That's very difficult to accept that something that is permissible, only bad can come from it.
Why is in this case question why it's permissible?
Because the Torah gave the reason why it's permissible, but it's permissible.
Even this is at the end something happened, always something bad.
That's what it seems. That's what it seems. It seems that there's, you do this, it's always going to be bad. So the Chasam Sofer says like this, very interesting. I mentioned before, and this is the first time I ever saw this idea. I never thought about it. So I mentioned to you that Rashi brings down the Talmud that says, why did the Torah permit the man to marry this woman? Because he's going to be out of control, and therefore better make it permissible than forbidden. And what if he's not out of control? What if he's a soldier, he's out of control, sees the woman, and he says, I'm going to take her. But not because he's in this crazed state that he can't control himself. He just sees her and he wants to marry her. Is he allowed to do that?
Yes. Why not?
Because the Torah just says you can do it. Right?
If you want, you can do it.
That's what the Torah says, exactly. Now at the same time, the Talmud says the background, the reason, so to speak. Why did the Torah allow such a thing? Because for such a case. But it's not the only case where the Torah is going to permit it, right? When you say the reason the Torah gave it because otherwise you could do it anyway, it sounds like that's the only case that the Torah permits. But that's not true. The Torah says you see her, you desire her, you can marry her. What's the reason as to why the Torah would allow such a thing? Because of that kind of situation. But it doesn't have to be that situation to be permitted to marry her. But if you marry her, but here's the thing. If you marry her because you're in that crazed state and you just can't have any control, and that's why you're marrying her, so the Chasam Sofer says, then you won't have it, then there's no problems. You had a reason for it. You had a reason. You had a good reason to do it. You had a reason to do it, and therefore, that's not the situation where we say the bad is going to come from. But if you just did it, meaning you could have controlled yourself, you just decided, I'd like to do it, that's where the Talmud says that that only bad's going to come out of that marriage. Because it's very clear that the Torah is not really condoning, the Torah doesn't want such a thing from the reason given, but the Torah has to allow it, but the Torah allowed because of that. But there's a distinction between when you're doing it, for what reason you're doing it. If you're doing it because you got to do it, you need to do it, all right, so the Torah said do it. But when you didn't need to do it, even though the Torah said you could, but you didn't need to, there already the Torah is saying it's not going to be good. So now, what happened by David? So David, Hushai said to him, you shouldn't have married her. David said, I was allowed. So when David married her, what was going on then? You'd assume, right, that David HaMelech, I shouldn't say you'd assume, but the way the Chasam Sofer wants to say, yeah, you would assume David HaMelech wouldn't just marry her. The righteous David HaMelech wouldn't just marry her. He felt he was in a state where he didn't have control. That's what he felt. But Hushai said to him, you made a mistake. You were the kind of person who could have controlled yourself. David HaMelech was a very humble person. And because a very humble person, he thought that the kind of state that he was in that situation, he felt he was in a state of not being able to control himself. But Hushai in that, and therefore, if that's really why he would have, if that was why he was marrying her because he couldn't control, then bad would not have come out of that marriage. But Hushai said to him, "You made a mistake. Basically, you should have known better. You should have believed in yourself more. Sometimes when a person is too humble, it's not good. You were too humble. You could have controlled yourself, and therefore, now that you married her anyway, that's why you have a rebellious son." So David HaMelech knew the idea, but David HaMelech felt it didn't apply to him. And on that, Hushai said, you were being too humble, and therefore you were not. This was not a marriage that you needed to do, and therefore you have this rebellious son. So it's a very, very novel approach. But what I take out, but a lesson that I think to take out of here is a lesson that's an important lesson. You can't be too humble. Being humble is one of the greatest traits around. But you can't be humble to a point that you don't believe in yourself. A person has to know themselves and they have to believe in themselves. Of course, every person, the challenge in life is that we have to make sure we don't trust ourselves too much, because then we get ourselves into trouble. But we can't not believe in ourselves either when we should believe in ourselves. And this was the situation with David HaMelech. David HaMelech felt he was being too humble. And therefore he felt he couldn't be in control. And Hushai said, no, you're a great enough person. You could have had the control. You should have realized that. You were being too humble. And therefore, that's why you had this rebellious son. But the point is, but I think the very important lesson to take out of this is this idea of we have to be able to believe in ourselves. We have to make sure that we understand our strength, not to go ahead and not believe in our abilities. We have to have a certain level of trust in Hashem and confidence in ourselves with that trust in Hashem to do what we need to do. And being too humble could actually bring big problems upon a person. It can bring to mistakes. It can bring to shirking responsibility. And it's a big challenge to, number one, not trust ourselves, not to be too confident in ourselves, because then we can stumble because of that, because we think nothing's going to affect us for bad. So we kind of take chances that we shouldn't. We do things, we look at things, we put ourselves in situations where we shouldn't. But at the same time, we also have to be able to size up a situation and believe in ourselves and say, I can deal with this. And every person's different. Every person's situation is different. And they have to understand the situation well. They have to have the guidance of the Torah and of their teachers. But there is a point where a person cannot be overly humble, and because of that, do not believe in themselves. And for David HaMelech, that was that situation at that time. Okay, thank you for listening. Have a wonderful evening.